Hi, I'm Aaron, your official Edelbrock installation guy. I'm here to make sure your new Edelbrock E Street EFI installation goes smooth and easy. But first I want to thank you for choosing Edelbrock. It's a name you know you can trust for quality and performance. Now we're going to be converting this hot little 69 Camaro over from an old carburetor to our modern EFI system. Now the cool thing about that is you're going to be able to just reach in and bump the key and it's going to fire up and idle right out of the get-go. Now a carburetor, as you know, you got to set the chokes or you got to pump it a few times. They're temperamental. You got to warm the engine up before it'll want to idle. So a lot of things that the advantage of an EFI system is over a carburetor that you're going to love. Now another thing is it makes tuning virtually maintenance free. You don't have to change jets or do anything. This does it all on the fly. Where a carburetor, you got to go in and tear it apart. You got to read spark plugs and do all kinds of things. You don't need to do that with this EFI system. It's going to do it all on its own, and it learns. So the more you drive, the better driving experience you're going to get out of this. Now for you guys out there that have cars that pull hard G's into corners, or for the four-wheel drive fans that are bouncing and hitting extreme angles, you're going to love this EFI system. Mainly because with carburetors, the gas starts sloshing around inside in these situations and it can cause flooding and stalling. With our EFI system, you're not going to have that issue. Now another cool thing is you're going to see a lot better throttle response and even better gas mileage with this new EFI system. Now for you guys out there that have engines like this with lumpy cams in them, you're going to love this new E Street EFI system because it works well with lumpy cams. Now a lot of other EFI systems out there in the market don't do that. The low vacuum signal at an idle confuses the EFI system and they don't want to idle. They end up hunting and pecking. Our system runs very smooth and it self-learns and gets better as you drive. Now another thing you're going to love about this system is that it works with both single and dual plane manifolds, whether it's a stock manifold or a high performance like we have on this engine here. Now something very important before we get started. This system uses a wideband O2 sensor, which means you're going to have to do some welding on the exhaust pipe. If you don't do your own welding or your own exhaust work in your own garage and you don't have those capabilities, take your car down first to your local exhaust shop and have them install the bung on your exhaust pipe and then plug it off and then drive it back home, and then the installation is going to go smooth for you. Now of course, if you do your own exhaust work, you can do your own welding in your own garage, this won't be a problem. To install the O2 sensor, use a 5/8 drill and you're going to drill it into the exhaust pipe between 2 and 6 inches after the header collector, but before the catalytic converter. So drill the hole. Make sure that you set this up to where the O2 sensor is positioned about 10 degrees facing upward. And then weld the bung on. Now if you're having an exhaust shop do this for you, we supply you with a plug. So once they weld it in, they can put the plug in. When you drive back home, you can remove the plug and go ahead and install the O2 sensor. Now I'm going to go ahead and do something that you do not need to do for your installation. I'm going to remove this hood. The only reason I'm going to do that is so we can get better camera angles to get you the better detail to help you with your installation. Now to get started, we need to remove this old carburetor. But before we do anything, first, disconnect the negative battery cable. Second, undo your gas cap to relieve any pressure that might be sitting in the fuel system. And thirdly, this engine's clean, but your engine may not be. So if you have any debris or dirt or leaves or something like that on your intake manifold or around your old carburetor, be sure to clean those off so when you take it off, you don't get stuff down inside your intake manifold. So go ahead and remove your air cleaner. And it helps to get a rag when you undo your fuel lines in case any residual fuel comes out. Remove all of your old linkages and return springs. If you have any vacuum lines that are in use, be sure to disconnect those. And take the carburetor off. Now if you have any old gasket debris on here, make sure you go ahead and take it off. Try not to get anything down inside the throat of the intake manifold. That's all nice and smooth now. So this is the fuel injection throttle body. And as you can see, it's got all kinds of little goodies on it. but it's very simple. If you can look, it's a beautiful piece. It's CNC machine. It's very nicely made. Now, if we look on the front, we have the two front injectors. We also have multiple vacuum ports. Now, the front right here, this big one, is for the PCV. And then we also have two manifold vacuum ports. And then up here, we also have a timed or ported vacuum, which gives you vacuum at part throttle. Then we look around over here to the back. We also have more vacuum ports, which is really great because a lot of intake manifolds don't have extra vacuum ports on them, especially one like this. This is a Victor Jr. There's really no vacuum ports on that. So what's great about this is if you have a manifold like that, you get these extra vacuum ports that you don't normally get. So this vacuum port right here would be for power brakes. And this one over here is also manifold vacuum, which would be for your, if you have an automatic transmission, your transmission modulator valve. And if we look elsewhere, here's the back two injectors. And this right here is the IAC, which is known as an idle air control valve. And then we have the fuel pressure sensor right here. And then on the side, we have a few more sensors. Now up here we have the MAP sensor, which is manifold absolute pressure. And then here we have the incoming air temperature sensor. And then right here is your throttle position sensor. Now another nice feature about this is once this is on the intake manifold, this is your fuel inlet line right over here. Now this comes in on the passenger side because the linkage here goes on the driver's side. So your fuel line will come in on the passenger side. If you're in a situation where your fuel line happens to come up on the driver's side, you can remove these fuel rails here. They're just held on under here by a couple of Allen screws. And then you can simply remove them, flip it around 180 degrees, and now this fuel inlet is going to be on the driver's side. So you don't have to run a line all the way around to the other side of the engine. It's just something that's an extra convenience for you if you need it. Now before we do anything, do not forget that the rags are in here. Go ahead and take these out. Remember, we put two of them in there. It's always a good idea to look down in and make sure nothing's in there. Now go ahead and install the studs. Then install the gasket. And then you can set your throttle body right on. Now on this side, we went ahead and installed longer studs because this car uses a throttle cable bracket assembly and return spring all in one unit. And just like installing any carburetor or any type of throttle body system, just go around all four corners, do it gently, and torque it evenly. You don't want to tighten one in one corner too tight, and then tighten the other one in another corner because that'll warp the base. Okay, now we have that on. Now a good thing to do once it's on is just check to make sure you have no obstructions or binding or anything going on with the linkage. That moves nice and freely. So next we need to install our coolant temperature sensor. So we're going to remove the old one. Now before you install the sensor, you might want to put some thread sealer on it to seal the threads. We're going to go ahead and use Teflon tape. Now a little trick to while you're doing this, go in the rotation of screwing it in. So turn it clockwise. That way it won't unravel when you're screwing it in. And we'll just snug this down. Okay, that should be good. Now the real brains to this system is the ECU. This is all the computer and everything in it, the programs and everything that control the entire EFI system. Now this is a simple thing to mount, and what's different about this than what a lot of other EFI systems have is that you can actually mount this inside the engine compartment. This has been a little bit heat-proofed and a little bit vibration-proofed, and some of the stuff that comes in the kit with it allows you to get rid of a little bit of vibration and stuff. A lot of other kits and EFI systems, you got to mount this inside the car, which makes wiring and everything else a little bit of a nightmare. But this you can actually go ahead and find a place under the hood. Now, under the hood can be just about anywhere, but you want to kind of keep it away as much as you can from the headers. I mean, you don't want to set it right on the header, obviously, where it's getting direct heat. But someplace, maybe up on a firewall, something like this, maybe in an inner fender. This is probably your best choice, is someplace like this, inner fender. Someplace anywhere from about mid or back from the engine. I don't think you want to mount this up towards the front of the radiator because then you're going to have wires running all across. So try and find a place that's suitable, somewhere's up on the firewall or over against the inner fender well here. I believe we're going to go ahead and try and mount this right here. Now we've gone ahead and mounted the ECU right here on the inner fender. Now be sure to use these grommets that come with the kit to prevent vibration from harming the box. All right, now we're at the time for the wiring, and I know this is a scary thing for some of you because you're not into wiring. Well, trust me, we've gone to great lengths to make this as simple as possible, and it is. It's really, really simple. Everything is labeled, and it lays out perfectly well. We've already done all the harness assembly for you. So if you look, you'll notice things on here. This one says fuel pump, or this one here says O2 sensor. So we've gone through great lengths to make this as simple as possible for you, so don't let it scare you. And another fact is, you cannot plug one of these plugs into another. In other words, you cannot plug the coolant temperature sensor into the O2 sensor. The plugs are completely different. Every plug is unique, and we've already laid the harness out, so all the plugs are together. So it's not a wiring nightmare. It's a very simple process, so don't let that scare you. So we can just take the harness, and it looks like spaghetti right now, but when we pull it on out, it lays itself out. So once we set this on here, here's our main plug right here for the ECU. So we can kind of lay this out a little bit and plug this in. And just kind of roughly lay it out so you get an idea of where things are going. And it's a good idea to route this harness to where it's coming from the back area to the throttle body. In other words, don't run them from the front of the engine like this. Run them from the back. A couple of reasons. One main one is it's kind of ugly with all the wires up front here. You kind of want to hide them and make it nice and sanitary looking. Another thing is it keeps them tucked out of the way so nothing gets near a fan belt or a fan or anything you may have up here. This harness here has all the plugs in it for everything at the TBI up here. So you can route these back underneath and around. And you want to try and keep the harness, if at all possible, away from spark plug wires. Like don't zip tie it together to the spark plug wires. Try and keep it as far away from those as you can so they don't pick up like RF signals or stray voltage or anything. Now sometimes obviously you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to get them somewhat near them. I mean, they're all in the same engine compartment after all. Now when you're over at the ECU here, we're going to have a fuse block and a relay that's going to get mounted right alongside of it. So we want to make sure you have some room here to mount these here. All right, so now we've gone ahead and routed our wiring nice and tidy. So it runs down along here, kind of hidden so it looks nice. And we've kept it back against the firewall away from the headers. You do not want your wiring touching the headers because it'll burn through and cause a major malfunction. So we've run it up and we've got it down below the distributor, about as far away from the distributor and wiring as we can possibly get, the plug wires and stuff. So also there's a couple other little things on the wiring here that you're going to have to do besides plugging in. One is we have a little pink wire down here, a coil wire, and that says switched 12 volts. So this is going to go to a 12-volt source where you have 12 volts not only while the key is on, but also while you're cranking. Now, a lot of cars, you can take it maybe from the positive side of the coil. Other cars, if you have a ballast resistor or a resistor wire, you're going to need to go before that resistor to make sure you're getting full 12 volts, not a resisted 12 volts. Or you can check your ignition switch or at your fuse block with a tester. Just make sure you have 12 volts both in the on position and while cranking. If you don't have it while cranking, your engine's not going to fire up. And then there's two other wires, and we'll talk about that as we get a little more into this. There's a big red and a big black. Now, the red goes to the positive side of the battery, and the black goes to the negative side of the battery. And you want to run those directly to the battery. This car here doesn't have a battery up front. It's mounted in the trunk. This car does a lot of autocross and hot street racing and slalom type stuff. So for better weight distribution, it's back in the trunk. So you don't see a battery up here. So we've run those wires and extended them and went right back to the trunk to the battery. Of course, if your car has a battery up front, just simply run the red and the black wire directly to your battery posts, and you'll be set to go. So we're going to reroute this in a nice tidy way, but I wanted to leave it out so you can see the pink wire that goes to a switch 12 volts. Otherwise, everything else just plugs in. So if we come down here, we have these wires down in here that are all going to plug in. And again, you can't mess up. Every plug fits a particular item on a throttle body. And they're also marked, even the injector plugs. Here's the injector. It says right front, left front. Right front, left front. So these just go to the right front and the left front on the throttle body. Keep in mind, you're talking about the car's right front and left front, not from you standing on the front of it. It's always for the engine. So this is the right side of the engine, that's the left side of the engine. So right front is going to go right into this injector. Left front is going to come on over and plug into this injector. Then we'll look at this one here. This says TPS, and I showed you earlier the TPS is right down here on the side. This plug will only go one way on it. That's in. Then we have one here, and it says coolant. So here's our coolant temperature sensor. We have one right here that says IAC, the idle air control. That's back here. Then we have another one here. It says MAP. That's the MAP sensor right on the side. This one says air temperature. So we're going to go right to the side to the air temperature. That sensor gets plugged in. Then we have a couple back here, which are the rear injectors. And again, this one says right rear and left rear. And then lastly, we have one here that says the fuel PSI, which is this little sensor right here. And that's really it. That's all there is to plugging this in. So now we're ready to hook up the throttle linkages and everything. But make sure on your carburetor that you remove any linkage components that might have been bolted onto the linkage arms, because you're going to reuse them on here. So we've got them off, and we're going to go ahead and install these. And then just attach your throttle linkages or cables or whatever you have. And then don't forget your return spring. And it's a good idea to give it a check to make sure you got full movement of the linkage. And if you need to do any adjustments to your throttle cables or linkage, now's the time to do that to make sure that's all taken care of. All right, we're almost done with all the wiring and all the hookup for the throttle body. There's one last little thing here. There's a plug back here which is for the tachometer signal. So you want to be sure that you get this wired in correctly to whatever type of tach signal you have. If you have a electronic ignition, such as an HEI, there's a terminal on there. If you have like an electronic high energy box, like an MSD box, there's a tach signal on that. If you don't have that, you might have a Hall effect. If you have any of those, we do supply you with a plug and a couple of extra wires, and it'll show you in the instructions exactly where these wire to and how to wire them in. Other than that, we're going to tidy the wires up here and move on to the next section. Now, one of the final steps we have with the throttle body are the vacuum lines. Now, I showed you on the throttle body earlier that there's all kinds of little vacuum ports, which is a really convenient thing to have, because a lot of manifolds like this Victor Jr. here, they don't have vacuum ports on them. So with this EFI system, they've given us an opportunity to hook things up that we couldn't hook up before. So we're going to go over these first. Now, on the back side, we had the big one, which was for the power brakes. Well, this car doesn't use power brakes. We have a hydro boost. Now, your car may use a vacuum signal for your power assist on your brakes, so that's what would hook up to there. We also have our transmission hooked up back here, the modulator from this automatic transmission. Now, if you don't have an automatic transmission or your transmission doesn't use a modulator, you simply plug that off. Now, we're not using a power brake source, so we're going to plug it off. Okay, that one's taken care of. Now, on the front, we have a couple of different ports. Up on top, I talked about earlier, we have a ported vacuum, or what they call timed vacuum. Now, a lot of vacuum advances on distributors use this particular port. Now, this is the one that's higher up on the throttle body. This only gets vacuum at part throttle. When you're idling, you should have no vacuum signal here. And like I say, a lot of distributors, most of them, if you have a vacuum advance, will use this particular port. Now, we don't use that. We're running a performance distributor on here that does not have a vacuum advance. Some cars use them, some cars don't. If you have a heavy or high-end performance engine like this, you may not have one. So if you don't, you can just plug that one off too. Now, these two smaller, lower ones right here are manifold vacuum. Now, those can be used for a number of different things using manifold vacuum. Now, if your distributor requires that you use manifold vacuum, then you would plug into one of these. Now, we're not going to use that, so we're going to plug it off. Now, we don't need the other manifold vacuum port either up here, but it's there if we did need it, so we're going to plug it off. Now, this engine before did not have a Pcv valve because of the manifold that we're running. Now we're able to have that, and it's a good idea to have a Pcv valve because it helps the engine have negative crankcase pressure or vacuum inside the engine. It's actually better for it. So we went ahead and installed one where we weren't able to have one before. So we're going to go ahead and plug that in. And the front of the carburetor right here, the big 3/8 one, that's for the Pcv hookup. And all the vacuum lines are set up. All right, now we're on to the next stage. Now, here's a really cool thing about this E Street EFI system. Most EFI systems in the past required you to get a custom gas tank put in your car, or one that you had to modify, because you need a high-pressure pump that either sits in the tank or that's mounted outside. And then you got to run your lines up, and you have to run a return line all the way back to the tank. Now, some people are already retrofitted with those, which is fine. If your car already has that, you can still use this EFI system. But for those of you that don't have that, if you have an early car such as this Camaro and you have your factory gas tank, Edelbrock came up with an awesome idea, which is their sump kit. Now, what this does, it really works a miracle. It's really neat because you use your existing fuel pump system. You don't have to modify your fuel tank. You don't have to modify your fuel lines. You don't even have to take your existing fuel pump off, whether it's mechanical or whether it's electric. Now, this particular car is outfitted with an electric pump, your typical 7 psi electric pump that pumps fuel from the tank up to the old carburetor. We're going to be able to maintain that. We don't need to do any modifications to the back of the car. That existing pump is going to simply come up here and fill this sump up with a low pressure, just like it got from the carburetor. And then inside this sump, this is really cool, it has a high pressure fuel pump already inside here and mechanisms in here like floats and on-off switches and stuff like that to regulate the amount of pressure, the proper amount of pressure for your new E Street throttle body. Now, what's really neat about this is you can mount this almost anywhere that you have space. If you have a larger engine bay and you got a bigger firewall, like if you had a truck or something like that, it could mount up on the firewall. If you didn't have fender wells that were curved like this, because you really want this in an upright position. You don't want it laid flat. It needs to be upright because this area here is what's going to fill up with the fuel. So you could mount it maybe to the side, keep it away from the headers, obviously. You don't want it resting on the header. Or maybe possibly up on the radiator support. Now, we have quite a bit of area on this radiator support because, as I said earlier, this particular car has its battery in the trunk. So we're wide open up here. So we've actually selected a spot up here, and that's where we're going to actually mount this. Now in your car you may have more room up here, you may have less, you may have more room back here to mount it. Wherever it's convenient for you to do that, that's where you want to put this. Now it's really simple. In the kit comes some extra brackets. We supply you with those. We supply you with all the plugs and everything to plug it in and all the fuel lines, and you'll be seeing that during this installation. Now just to show you on the top of this, as you can see, this is the fuel inlet which comes off your existing fuel pump. That's what's going to fill this sump up. Then we have the high pressure outlet line which goes from here through a high pressure filter that you'll see. We supply you with that. Then it's going to go up to the TBI. And then we have a vent line and then a plug which simply activates the electricity going to the relay for the fuel pump in here. It's really simple. I mean, it's a great idea that they had, and it really makes it nice because where you had to do major modifications to your car before to install an EFI system, you don't have to. This takes care of everything. All right, as you can see, we removed the fender brace here. We've mounted the sump right against the radiator support. Now to hook up the sump, the kit comes with all the necessary hardware that you're going to need, including high pressure fuel line. You're going to get some push lock fittings. You're also going to get some other brass fittings that these will go on your fuel pump, your existing fuel pump lines that feed the sump. You'll get a pre-fuel filter, which is a low pressure fuel filter that goes from your existing fuel pump, whether it's a mechanical or whether it's electrical. This will go from your pump to the sump. And then after the sump, on the high pressure side, we supply you with a high pressure fuel filter. And this goes between the output line coming from the sump going to your throttle body. Now we've gone ahead and installed the brass fitting on the output of our electric fuel pump, and this is going to go from here to the sump. If you're running a mechanical fuel pump and you want to install the brass fittings that come with the kit, you simply clean the fuel line, slide on the nut, and then screw on the nipple side of the fitting, and then cinch it down. The internal ferrule will grip the steel line and ensure a leak-free fit. Now that line can go from there through the pre-filter over to the sump. We supply you with two brass fittings in case your fuel pump outlet line is 5/16 or 3/8. You have either size, but make sure that the nipple side going to the filter and to the sump is 3/8 in size. To install the hose on a push lock fitting, first put a little dab of lube on the barbs and then slide the hose on. Try applying a little bit of heat to the hose. It'll help it slide on a little easier. Make sure you seat the hose all the way to the end. Now the cool thing with these fittings is that they do not require the use of a hose clamp. So we've gone ahead and cut our line and we've installed the push lock end on one side, our pre-filter, and then this side of the hose here is going to connect to where our fuel pump outlet is. So the output side of our fuel pump is going to connect in here. It's going to come through the filter and go right into our sump. So if we just simply screw this on, and then we simply slip this on the nipple, and we tighten our hose clamp down. Now the supply from our pump to the sump is installed. To tidy this up a little bit nicer, we went ahead and put a pair of line clamps here to secure the fuel line against the inner fender. It just keeps it tucked back out of the way and it looks a lot nicer. So next we've gone ahead and made the high pressure line, which is going to come out of our sump and go up to our throttle body. So we've gone ahead and installed the 90-degree end on this, the number 6 end. We've installed the high pressure fuel filter and then the other end that goes up to throttle body, and just simply route it whatever way suits you the best. Now, as you can see, we've chosen to come along here and route it behind the alternator and up this way. Now, you can route it pretty much anywhere you want, but just keep it where it doesn't have any kinks in it and it's away from heat source like your headers and such. be sure to use a supplied clamp to hold the fuel filter in place. Now the last line we made was the vent line for the sump. So we're using the supplied fitting that came along with it, and we're also using a piece of 3/8 fuel line. You do not want to use the line supplied with our kit because that's a high pressure line. So just get yourself any type of 3/8 inch supple type of fuel line and make it whatever length you want. Now we're going to route ours down right alongside the radiator here because again, this is just a vent tube. Well, now we're at the stage for wiring our sump in, because remember, there's a fuel pump inside the sump. That's our high pressure pump. So it's going to need some juice to get it going. So what's supplied in the kit that you're going to get is a fuel pump relay, and it's also going to have a main fuse. So you're going to need to mount these to the fender. And then of course there's a couple of plugs on it. The red wire is going to need a constant 12-volt source. So you're going to want to wire this in someplace where it's always 12 volts. And then the plugs I just talked about, one plugs directly into the harness, your EFI harness. The other plugs into an extension that we supply, which is going to go over to the sump. That way, if your sump is mounted a little farther away, you can extend to it. All right, while you weren't looking, we went ahead and mounted our harness that goes over to the sump. So as you can see, we have the relay mounted right here. We've got the main fuse. And then over here, we've plugged in. And we have the lead that goes over to the sump, and then here's the plug that goes into the sump. Now, a very important thing, do not plug the sump in right now, because the fuel pump in there, we do not want power going to it. Everything's wired in, but do not plug this in right now. Now you can go ahead and connect the battery up so we have full electrical to the system. But again, do not plug the sump in. We're not ready for the pressure yet. So once the battery's plugged in, we need to prime the system. Now if you have a mechanical fuel pump, you're going to want to crank the engine over for about 10 seconds. And then what that'll do is it'll pump some fuel through the system and it'll start filling the sump up. Then shut it off for about 30 seconds. Give it about 30 seconds. Then do it one more time. Crank your engine over and get it to crank over. And what's happening is the mechanical pump is going to force fuel and you're going to fill up this sump. You're basically priming the sump so the fuel pump and everything in the sump will be submerged and it'll have enough fuel in there so when we make our connections, we can run our high pressure over to the TBI, but we're not ready for that yet, so go ahead and crank it over. Now, we're not going to have to do this on this engine, obviously, because we have an electric fuel pump. So when we're ready to check the system and to prime it, we just turn the key on, listen for our electric fuel pump, we'll run it for maybe 15 seconds or so, it'll fill the sump up, and we're primed. Then we'll go to the next step. Now, an easy way to tell if you're getting fuel to the sump while you're cranking the engine is to simply look at the clear fuel filter. If fuel is flowing, you'll see it in the filter. Well, now that we know that our sump is full and primed, now we can connect our electrical connectors. Now, once this is plugged in, we can go into the car, turn the key to the on position, and the high pressure pump inside here is going to cycle fuel up to the TBI. This is the time you want to check for leaks anywhere along here. Now, once we know those are all dry, now we're ready to fire this baby up. Well, now that we've got everything installed and we've primed the sump, we've checked our electrical connections, we've checked for leaks, everything's working, now we're ready to get this thing to fire up. So we're going to check out our tablet. Now, the E Street EFI system comes with a neat wireless tablet. This is basically the tuning brains for your system, and the cool thing is it's wireless. You don't have to plug anything in. The only thing you need to plug in ahead of time is the charger. Make sure it's charged up. Now, we supply you with two different types of chargers. We supply you with an AC 110 volt charger, and we also supply you with a car charger that plugs into a cigarette lighter or a power outlet. For future use, we also give you a mount to go either on the dash or the windshield, and we even give you a non-glare screen protector. So be sure to put that on when you're done to make sure your screen stays nice and clean and unscratched. Well, now we're at the stage where we're ready to fire it up using the tablet that's supplied with the E Street EFI system. But we want to make sure we go over checklist first, just one last time to make sure everything is done. Has the battery been reconnected? Have all linkages been reconnected? Have all wiring harness connectors been connected? Has the supplemental fuel system been installed? Has the fuel system been checked for leaks? Is the gas tank refilled with unleaded fuel? And make sure the gas tank is full at this point to be sure you have enough fuel. Has the O2 sensor been installed and connected? If you don't already have them, be sure you've installed resistor-type spark plugs as well as high-suppression spark plug wires to prevent RF signal from interfering with your wireless tablet and the ECU. And lastly, make sure the tablet is fully charged. So now we're at the stage where we're ready to turn the tablet on. So just simply push the power button and hold for about 3 or 4 seconds. And just like any tablet that you may have at home or that you see people have these days, it's going to boot up just like those do. Once the screen pops up, it's ready to initiate the E Street EFI program. So simply select the program and it'll open. This is what the initial setup page looks like. And if we look up here, there's an engine icon with a red X in it. That's telling us that the tablet is not connected to the module. So to connect it, be sure the ignition key is on and that power is going to the ECU system. Once that's on, just touch this red X and it'll start to connect. Now we can see a green check mark there, so this tablet is now connected to the East Street EFI control center. So now we can go through vehicle setup. We want to select the setup wizard to help us set it up for the initial first time. Now we're working with a 350 Chevy engine that's been bored 30 over, so that makes 355 cubic inches. Now we're ready to select the camshaft. Now if you have a mild camshaft, or you have one that's a little bit hotter for the street, or one that's pretty healthy for the street or for race use, this is where you're going to select it. Now this engine has a very healthy cam in it, so we're going to select the race and continue. Although this engine is a hot little 350, it's probably not making more than 500 horsepower. So we're going to select the 500 max and continue from there. Now it's sending all this information wirelessly to the ECU. And it's telling us calibration is successfully loaded. Now we need to power cycle the ignition and press next to continue. So we're going to do that by turning the key off for about 10 seconds. Now we just powered the key back on. You see a connection up here. If it doesn't connect, then we'll just push the X and it will automatically reconnect. Okay. And now you can see we're connected. Now we're ready to move on to the next step. Now it's time to set the rev limiter. Now the engine we're using is going to peak out at about 7,000 RPM. So we're going to set the limiter to 6,800. Now, even though our max RPM on this engine is about 7,000, we're setting it at 6,800 because once the rev limiter function engages, the engine can still increase another 200 to 300 RPM. So you want to be sure that you set it about 200 or 300 RPM lower than your max point. And then continue. Now we're ready to fire the engine up. When the coolant temperature reaches 170 degrees, the idle ready status icon will go from red to green, letting you know that now it's time to go ahead and adjust your idle speed on the throttle body. So push next and go to the idle tuning calibrate. Now you can adjust your idle with the up or down, the plus or minus on the left-hand side. And the idle's going to try and follow that green arrow to the right. So we're going to give it some more and bring it up. And we're watching our idle speed. And the idle's trying to follow the little green arrow. That's your target. And we'll adjust it a little bit more until we get the desired idle. Now that we've got that set, we're going to go to next. Now it's time to calibrate the TPS, the throttle position sensor. This is the time you just want the engine idling. Don't touch the throttle pedal or anything, just let it idle, and then just simply touch the TPS in the lower right corner, and it'll self-calibrate. And once that's done, you're done. Now we're going to go back to the home page, and we're going to select the middle selection, gauge displays. Now there's several different types. We can go to the eTuner display, and as you can see here, we have a multitude of readouts. We have vacuum, engine coolant temperature, and the air-fuel ratio correction. Then we actually have the tachometer, and then it shows over here whether we're in open loop or closed loop section, and then it's going to tell us whether we're in self-learn mode or not. And then at the bottom is the air-fuel ratio. Now we can go into another dash, which is the E Street dashboard. Now it's very similar, but it looks a little different. Now this has a gauge for the coolant temperature, it has a gauge for the air-fuel correction, it has a gauge for the vacuum, and a tachometer. And if we look here, here's your throttle position sensor, your actual air-fuel ratio, and of course it tells you if you're in closed loop or open loop system. And a lot of these are variable that you can change and adjust on the fly. Now if there's something you want to go back and readjust, it's very simple. Just go to Home. You can go into Vehicle Setup. You can go to Advanced Tuning. So let's look at the different parameters that we can adjust. We have the air-fuel ratios. And you can adjust your idle air-fuel ratio, your cruising air-fuel ratio, or your wide-open throttle air-fuel ratio by simply going up or down using the plus or minus keys. And once you're done, hit Finish. Then if you'd like to go back, you can look at your acceleration fuel. And it's very much like adjusting a carburetor. Think carburetor. Your pump shot, do you want more or less? Shot duration, how long do you want that shot? Do you want it longer or shorter? And there's many other adjustments that you can do on the fly. And when you're done, hit Finish. Then you can go back and we can look at fan controls. If you have air conditioning on your car, you can adjust when the air conditioning kicks on your idle speed. You can adjust when the fan 1 kicks on or fan 2 if you have electric fans. We've already showed you idle tuning. We can go in and adjust what idle RPM that we would like. And once we're done with that, we can go into the TPS calibration and set that. And then we have a cold start enrichment. This helps you start in the morning. A cold engine needs more fuel. So sometimes in a colder weather, you might want to give it more fuel to help it start in the initial startup easier. And once you're done with that, hit Finish. You can always use this arrow right here to go back to the previous menu. We have some on-off options. This allows you to turn on or off your idle control or the self-learning ability. And once you're done with that, making any adjustments, you can hit Finish and that loads it into the system. And we can go back, and now you can set the rev limiter. And again, you can set the rev limiter by simply adding or subtracting how much RPM you want. Once that's set, press OK. All right, well now we've got this E Street EFI system on this little beast and it runs really, really well. Now, a couple things you need to know. Once you put a system on this, you do need to go out and drive it a little bit because it's a self-learning system. It has to learn what your driving procedures are, what your engine configuration is, because every camshaft's different, every set of heads is different, transmission, gearing, exhaust. It's going to learn all that. So it's going to take a little bit of a while for this thing to kind of get used to what's going on. And of course, you saw in the tablet, you can go in and change some of the parameters yourself, even beyond that, which is pretty nice. Now, if you run into any problems with yours, we do have a nice troubleshooting section. It's on page 18 of the installation manual. And it covers everything that you can possibly run into, whether it's not starting, or you're having a poor idle vacuum, or it doesn't accelerate well at wide open throttle. We give you very, very detailed procedures to go look for, whether it's this plug over here, or whether this isn't adjusted right, or what to go into on your tablet to go adjust that. And it's very, very simple, so be sure you check that out. Chances are you're not going to run into that, because this is a very simple system to install and you're going to have a lot of fun with it. Again, we want to thank you for choosing Edelbrock, and we hope you enjoy your new system. That's a really quick throttle response.